Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman Kim, for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, you will have to bear with me all day now. So not all day, but because we have some very, very interesting speakers. I think the subject of today's conference couldn't be better because, to be very frank, we have been discussing what we always call delivering value to our customers on and off over the last, I would say, 10, 15 years. Why are we doing that? It's quite simple. Because our industry, our medium, trade fairs, is in strong competition with other means of communication. And when I talk about other means of communication, I talk, of course, about the internet, what we call social media, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to the question, how can we make sure that our medium, the trade shows, are successful, it is all about delivering value. And if we are able, and if we, let's say, succeed in delivering that value to our customers, I have no doubt that our medium trade shows will not only be successful in the future, but it will be really a sustainable medium to be in and to make business. Now, in that regard, I really believe that the subject of today's conference is extremely well chosen, and I'm really happy to be here and to be the moderator. We have exactly 6 sessions today, each of about 50 minutes. I don't know how long the speeches will be, but my suggestion would be the speeches are about, let's say, 34, 40 minutes each, and then you will have time for questions and answers. And I think there is enough of content which we will hear today where you might have some comments, questions, how things are being done, and so forth. So I will soon kick off with my, let's say, opening presentation. This is more or less a presentation where we sort of cover what's going on in the world, what trends we see, and so on and so forth. And then Ian will follow. Basically, he will really kick off the value discussion, so to say. How can we create better value to our exhibitors? And then Benjamin will talk about basically, I would say, marketing techniques, using the new techniques which we can find on the trade floor. And then Jason will follow up with basically how they, from GES, are able to deliver value. And then Professor Mollerup will talk about way signage, I think something really, really interesting, particularly since I always say the only reason for exhibitors to come to a trade show are the visitors. And we have to keep that in mind. The only reason for exhibitors to come to a trade show are the visitors. So treat the visitors carefully, and I think way signage is certainly something where you will have a lot of compliment from the visitors if you do that correctly. Last but not least, we will have here Claude Montbré from Switzerland. Claude just sent me an SMS and said, Jochen, I'm on my way. So I think he just arrived by plane. He will be here by 10 o'clock, but he has plenty of time. He will be talking about sustainability in our industry, a subject which is really of significant interest, and also in something where we can say delivering value to our customer also means that we have to deliver that value in a sustainable way. Now, something is happening. Yeah, I come down. Okay. There comes the technician. Shall I start all over again now? Okay. So then let me start. I kick off. Basically, I hope the presentation that's already in. The presentation is called Global Trends in the Exhibition Industry. Certainly, I cannot cover all of the world here, but I try to cover as much as I can with a specific view also to this country. Let me kick off now. What I will do first, I give you, and Chairman Kim already touched on that, I'll give you a brief overview of what is the general economical global situation. And then I will come basically to regional trends. Again, I will not be able to cover all regions in this world because that would be simply too much. But then I will also touch on what happened in the first 10 years of this millennium, so to see how were the developments. And then I will give an outlook and basically talk a little bit about trends in our industry, and then of course at the end a summary. Now, what has happened? And as you can see here, our global economy has made a nice dip downwards in the last year, mid of 2008 to mid of 2009. And the latest IMF forecast is very, very clear. The economy is moving up. So it is something which we typically would call a V-shaped recovery. V-shaped recovery said we have a dip deep and then we go up quite strongly. Now, is that really something we can trust in? I personally am not so sure. Why? Because what do we see in the world? We see budget deficits all over. We see a huge amount of public debts. We see stimulus package in the United States still going on. In other countries, they are discontinued. We see money supply is not enough. There is money, but it is difficult for the different industries to get hold of that money. We see in a lot of economies consumer spending going down. We see savings ratios still high, far too high compared to the past. And we see unemployment also on the rise. So is this the right environment for a V-shaped recovery, ladies and gentlemen? Let's take a look. Some say, yes, it's champagne, and some say it's tears. Now let's look at the first thing, public debt. And I just give you some examples here. And as you can see here, your country, South Korea, is doing extremely well. This is always public debt as a percentage of GDP. But you look at countries like Japan, with a public debt of nearly 200%. And all the European countries, I don't know whether you've heard about that expression, Maastricht Treaty. That was a treaty in the EU where they said, okay, we have to limit our debt to 60% of GDP. All the major European countries are not sticking to that limitation. So there is basically a situation globally which I see there is far too much debt, and as a consequence of that, countries have to pay far too much interest, and as a consequence of that, there is not enough money available to really stimulate the economy. The second thing is money supply. Here you can see basically the money demand on the bank lending capacity on the left-hand side compared to the credit demand growth on the right-hand side. And you can see that in the year 2010, there is not enough bank lending capacity growth compared to the credit demand growth, which is of course a squeeze for the different industries, because if they want to invest, they need credit and they need the money. The second point, unemployment. And if you look at the major countries, France or the Euro area, also United States and UK, employment has risen steadily since the financial crisis. Except for Germany, where employment came down slightly, in all the major Western economies, employment has increased, which is of course not sustainable. Last but not least, we have looked at the savings ratios, and there are two comparisons here. You see on the left-hand side the savings ratio in China, which is historically always high. China doesn't have any pension funds. China doesn't have a social security system. China doesn't have health system. So basically Chinese save. But the concerning thing here is the savings rate in the United States, which has increased steadily since about 2005. And you know what it means, what if the US consumer saves 1% more than previous year, this is 1% saving of the US consumer. This is 100 billion US dollars in foregone spending. So 1% represents 100 billion US dollar in foregone spending. We come later to the consequences of that. What I wanted to say is the spending ability and the spending willingness of the customers are going down. Last but not least, consumer spending not improved. If you look at this chart, you see from 2005 to 2007, consumer spending went up, but then basically, except for France, it went down again. In the United States, it seems to pick up again, but we have to see how the situation is going to develop. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the global, let's say, economical situation. So now the question is the recovery ahead? Let's summarize. There is lack of money supply. There are no more stimulus package except for the United States. There is high unemployment. There is lack of private consumption. And there is basically spending cuts of governments all over. So some people say exports will save us, particularly countries like in the EU say exports will save us. I don't believe it, because exports basically need markets where you have consumption. And what you've seen before, very difficult to find markets where you have consumption. And Asia will not be basically saving us in that regard. So my view is there might be a recovery, but it will not be sustainable, it will not be straight. We will have basically quite a difficult path ahead of us. I don't believe totally in a V-shaped recovery. It will be going upwards like this. What does it mean for our industry? And we have done some research here, and we looked at basically the top 42 trade fair companies in the world. And we see what happened between 2008 and 2009, and you can see here the turnover of these top 42 companies came down by nearly 13%. And then basically, if you take the top 10 turnover, so out of these top 42, we have taken top 10 companies, it came down by 14%, and the rest came down by 12%. But we also had some companies who grew. Yeah, for example, these 9.1%, which you see here, these are 10 companies out of the top 42 who grew by 9%, which of course means that the rest of those companies had quite a significant decline in business of 13%. I'll show you later, we have also seen countries, particularly, for example, Russia and the South European countries, where business declined up to 30, 40, and in some cases even 50%. So the consequences of the financial crisis for our industry were really, really significant. Now, the Korean trade fair industry has done fairly well in this environment. It even grew a little bit, and this is also reflected, of course, in the GDP development, which you also could see here in this country. Now let's come to the regional review here, and let's kick off with Europe. This is a weather map of Europe, and here you can see basically the difference in all these countries. But one thing is clear, the weather map is expressed in dark clouds and light clouds and a little bit sun. Basically what you can see is all over Eastern Europe, all over Southern Europe, the clouds are dark. There is a little bit of sunshine and there's a little bit of light clouds in Central Europe, and then a little bit of that in Northern Europe, but Southern Europe and Eastern Europe is fairly dark, rainy and thunderstorms from time to time. And you've heard about the Greek crisis. You now might have heard about Ireland. You will have heard about the situation of Spain, so that is not really a sustainable situation. So what does it mean for the trade fair business in our countries? First of all, Italy. The business was down by about 15% in 2009. I don't think there will be a recovery in 2010, and I expect, if at all, a moderate growth again in Italy in 2011. France, Business has declined in 2009. There will not be a recovery in 2010 and 2011. Spain, the business has been affected very, very strongly, up to 35% loss. There will not be a recovery in 2010, not a recovery in 2011. UK is a small domestic market, little capacity. The business was down also by about 15%. And it will continue to struggle in 2010 and 2011 because the business is very, very domestic. Eastern Europe has been, as you could see on the weather map, extremely volatile. The trade fair business is down by about 25% all over the Eastern European countries, with differences. Some are down by 30%, some down by 15%. The outlook for 2010 and 2011 is very dim, very, very dim. There will not be an improvement. Germany had a difficult 2009. There is no recovery in Germany in 2010. You will see that later on. And 2011 will see some slight improvement, but really not too strongly. Let's take a look into Germany, which is basically a fairly typical situation for the European trade fair business. What you can see here on top of this chart is a capacity development in Germany basically over the last 10 years. So we kick off in 2000 with a capacity of 2.4 million square meters, and then you have a compound annual growth rate of about 2%, which brings us to 2.7 million square meters. So this is the growth rate in Germany for the hall capacity. Now compare that to the growth rate in net rented square meters. This, ladies and gentlemen, the first 4 years were the consequences in the trade fair business in Germany after the crisis in 2000. So you see the effects of that. And then following that, we had an increase of 15% year over year up to the year 2007, 2008. And then comes the next financial crisis, and you see in 2009 how the business declined. In 2010, there will be another decline. So basically what you can see here, the compound annual growth rate was negative with 2.4% over the last 10 years. And at the same time, you have a capacity increase of about 2% over the last 10 years. That, of course, is not a healthy situation, and you see the competition in Germany is extremely stiff. We have a fairly similar situation in the South European countries, where the rented space situation is even worse than in Germany. So that is a little bit characteristic of the trade fair situation in the Western European countries. So what are the regional trends? What can we see? Spain and UK, basically the eastern part, the southern part, and UK Ireland is very gloomy. Italy will see moderate growth, as I said before. In France and Germany, we will see the start of the recovery perhaps in 2011. What we could see in the crisis is, quite frankly, that always the lead shows have performed very well. Why? Because lead shows have a tendency to be crisis resistant, that lead shows have a tendency where exhibitors and visitors say, okay, if there are, let's say, 20 shows on one subject, we will pick the lead shows and go there. We had in Budapest at the UFI seminar, we had one exhibitor stating that in the crisis, they have reduced the number of trade shows where they participated from 32 to 2. And those 2 were the international lead shows in the respective subject. So this is a very clear tendency. Lead shows tend to perform much better in the crisis than all the other shows, particularly domestic shows. Business will stay volatile, and as I said before, if you have a diversified portfolio and if you have a diversified attendance, then the chances of being successful even in the crisis are very high. So what are the strategic trends? It's basically convergence and social media. We'll touch on that later. Return on investment for exhibitors and visitors is exactly the subject we are here for. This is a strategic trend everybody's looking at. Sustainability and internationalization means basically that a lot of companies are trying to diversify their business and go into different regions of the world. Let's take a brief look at Russia. Russia basically is a huge country with 11 time zones, we tend to forget that. The country is really depending on oil and gas. It has high unemployment. It has a decreasing population. The latest estimates for Russia are in the year 2050. There will be more than 50% of the population Muslims. So that is another issue which they have to deal with. There is lack of money supply, which is clear, altogether a red light. The deficit is quite okay. It's not too bad for Russia. It's basically slowing down. Inflation is still high, but also slowing down. Now, the good thing is GDP is expected to grow back again. The growth is expected to reach 4 to 5% in 2011. The wages are rising. That, of course, increases domestic demand, which is also a very, very positive. And then there was a strong increase in industrial output in the second quarter of 2010. So these are all fairly positive signals. Now, what does it mean for the trade fair business in Russia? It was a very, very difficult 2009, decreases of up to 30%. There will not be a recovery in 2010 or 2011. We have a shortage of venue capacity, basically all over the country. That's a big problem, and we have a shortage of quality venue also. Moscow and St. Petersburg are the trade fair cities #1. There is consolidation in St. Petersburg, and this is a new project being built in St. Petersburg now. This is Gazprom. You've heard of that company. They have decided to go into the trade fair and conference business. So this is a venue which will be built. They're kicking off the construction in 2010 in this year, and the first stage will be 50,000 square meters with a conference center. At the same time, they have bought one of the major organizers in St. Petersburg, so there is consolidation. Opportunities for organizers, infrastructure, machinery, and then, of course, Olympic Games and consumer goods is a big issue in Russia. North America. So here you see a little bit of characteristic. What is the situation in North America? There is high unemployment. There's not really much consumer confidence, even though it seems to pick up again. Consumer spending is still down. Savings ratios, as I've showed you, are high. Repayment of debts is one of the major issues households have in the United States. Housing finance system needs complete restructuring. They found out now that a lot of the foreclosure documents they need to have are not valid, so the whole processes have to start again. Interest rate is low, and there is more quantitative easing likely. That means basically that the Feds will be printing more US dollars in the future. And here you see basically the cartoon, Obama standing on the cliff and saying, I'm just putting the economy out of the ditch, and where is it going? I hope that the cartoonist is not right, so let's wait and see. So the GDP growth in the United States, as you can see here, was very hard hit in the financial crisis, came nicely up, but the forecast for 2010 following is not really extremely positive. And actually the rates you see here, I doubt whether they will be met. I think it will be slightly below that. So it will come out around 1.5 to 2%. That would be my forecast. So what is the United States doing? And here you see Fred Bernanke with a big scissor cutting the interest rate. And then you see Fred Bernanke in this helicopter, which I called QE2, quantitative easing 2. He's pouring money over the table. So basically the interest is, of course, keep the interest rates low, yeah, and then increase the money supply, and through the increase of the money supply, keep the dollar low as well. That will help the exports. I doubt whether this is correct. I don't think the United States will really increase their exports through a low dollar. They have structural problems in their export business, and if they don't solve these structural problems, then there will not be a major increase in their export business. So let's wait how this continues. But rumors already say that the Fed are already thinking about a QE3. I don't think it's the right measure on the long term. So what happened in the trade fair business? Here you can see the CEIR. This is basically indicating how the trade fair business developed in the United States. And what you can see here is after the crisis in 2000, the trade fair business went down. You remember Germany? Same. Then it went up again. 2007, it reached the peak, 2000, and then it came down, 2008 and 2009.
And also in 2010, the first 2 quarters, it went further down. The good thing in 2010, in the second quarter, it was the first time that the visitor numbers increased again, so this was a very good sign. And then in the third quarter of 2010, that's the latest news from CEIR, the third quarter of 2010, also the exhibitor numbers improved slightly. So there is light at the end of the tunnel, even though it's going to be difficult. Now the interesting chart here is this one. This is how GDP basically is tracking, or how the SEER index is tracking GDP. So what you can see here, and SEER is doing a very nice job here, they are showing how on the one hand GDP is developing, and how on the other hand our industry is developing. So basically the message is our industry strongly depends on our overall economy. And this is, I think, something you can see here very nicely, and I believe this applies to all of our industry all over the world. So what is the outlook for the United States? It is an extremely fragmented market with many, many, many small organizers. You have some organizers who have 1 show, 2 shows, and they live nicely on that. We have many regional shows. You don't have really a lot of lead shows. The whole American market doesn't have that lead show system. There is little diversification and mainly national events in that countries. So what do I see? I see basically in this year a further decline of KPIs for 2010 in the United States. I believe also that US organizers need to be more active abroad. They need to diversify because otherwise they are too dependent on the domestic economy. And I think that also M&A is likely to grow in the United States in the next years. Let's take a look into Asia. This is where we are today. And here you can basically see how Asia dominated the growth in the world. We have taken 5 areas. The green one is the Euro area, the dark gray one, the United States, the light gray is China, blue is India, and the light green is Russia. So what you can see here, the growth rates from 2001 to 2008 were all positive, but much lower growth rates, of course, in Europe than in Asia, and Asia has been dominated by the growth rates of India and China. Then comes 2009, and you see how India and China both again dominate the growth in the world. And then in 2009, you also see Russia with a minus of 7.9%. Here you see the strong dependency of the country of oil and gas. Yeah. And then again, basically, the years 2010 and 2011 as a forecast, you see that both China and India really are making the pace in terms of growth rates in the world. Now, Korea has grown as well, stable over the last years, at a slower rate than all the other Asian economies. So Korea was hit harder by the financial crisis than many of other Asian economies. But the good news is there was growth in the economy, and that I think is something which is extremely positive. Now, what is the situation in Asia for our trade fair business? Here you see the time period between 2004 and 2011. First of all, you see a strong, strong increase in hall capacity. You see from 2.9 million square meters in Asia to 6 million square meters in 2010, which is representing a growth of nearly 16%. And then the rented space basically grew at a rate of 13%. Again, you can see how China dominates the business. 65% of hall capacity in China, 53% of rented space in China as well. Now this is indicating something else too. China has a lot of overcapacities. It's very clear. They have 65% capacity, but only renting 53%. Korea at about 4.5% of the Asian capacity, renting 5%. So the capacity utilization in this country is fairly well. I think there's only one country where the capacity utilization is better than that is Hong Kong. The other message here is the growth is slowing down, particularly in the capacity development. You have 1% growth. from 2010 to 2011. So the growth is slowing down. That also applies, of course, to the net rented square meters. It is coming down. We will see lower growth rates in the next years than we have seen in the first years of the millennium. Let's take a look into China. Growth rates in China are quite impressive. We are always running between 9 and 10%. You see the yellow dots here. This was the forecast of the IMF of the last year, and China actually has performed even better than forecast. But China also has some problems. Let's face it. The growth in the country is driven by exports. And here you can see the two guys standing on the Chinese wall and saying, apparently you can see our GDP from space, which is, of course, some truth in that. But with the exports, of course, the good news is foreign reserves are extremely high. They are now at about, this is something like 2.1, but they're actually at 2.7 trillion US dollars, a tremendous amount of money. Now, the problem is, if the economy of China is basically driven by exports, yeah, it is depending on the purchasing power in the United States and Europe. But what we have seen before, and I showed you before, consumer spending in the United States and Europe is going down, and the savings ratios are going up. So what happens if this money flow is not as stable anymore? Then China needs to sort of redirect their economy, because they need a growth of at least 8 to 8.5% to put about 20, well, even more, to put all the students they generate into jobs. So what do they need then? They need more imports, very clearly. They need to increase the import business. They need more domestic consumption. But on the other hand, they need to keep the wages under control. And here you see the structural problem of the country. A country which needs more domestic consumption can only do that if the wages come up. But if the wages come up, they squeeze the profits of the companies. So this will be a very interesting subject to watch over the next years, how the Chinese government will deal with this situation. Trade fair situation, as I said before, the growth rate is closing down. China has now in excess of 4 million square meters hall capacity and quite a good quality. Here you can see the growth rates have been quite strong over the last years. The rented space has also increased steadily. So basically that growth rate is very impressive, and the Chinese government have pressed because they've recognized trade fair business is good for the economy and is good for the growth as well. So what does putting up their brand, but what is their brand? What is the country standing for? And that, of course, is also reflected a little bit in the trade fair business. And I think it would be worthwhile thinking about what is the brand of the country. Now, what is the trade fair industry? It is the number 3 in exhibition space in Asia. Now I say number 3. If you only look at the real figures, it would be number 4, because India has a little bit more of space. But you have to discount the space in India because it is not of quality. I would not really consider that qualitative exhibition space. So I would say Korea is number 3. It has a very good capacity utilization. Very clear. It's steady growth in net rented square meters. It is a very competitive domestic market, very clear, and the pronunciation is domestic. The business is strongly influenced by association and governmental institutions, many Me Too events, and then of course comes a little downside, in my view at least. It's mainly domestic business. And here is, I think, let's say, the task for the next years. Internationalize the business. Very few foreign organizers. We only have 12 UFI-approved events in the country, which is, in my view, not enough. It is not easy for foreign organizers to enter the country, and there is a lack in what I see in marketing and sales activities abroad. And I believe if the country wants to fulfill the plan, which you see here, then you need to step up in these activities. You have heard about basically the cooperation between government and industry. It's reflecting in 5 areas. First of all, infrastructure. Secondly, internationalization. Thirdly, quality improvement. Fourth, improvement of competitiveness. And fifth, improved services. These are all right things to do, no doubt about it, and I think it's the right approach. But let me ask some questions. What criteria are used? The government has, and the industry has said, we want to be the trade fair country number 10 in the world. Now the question for me is, under what criteria? Is it the capacity, or what is it? I don't know that, and I don't see that. The next question is, how are you going to attract international exhibitors? How is this going to happen? There also, I don't see a very clear plan. How will education take place? There is some activity, I know that in terms of education, but I think it needs to be stepped up. And what are the key success factors also? Is it international participation? Is it just rented space? Is it international visitors? You need to really have a set of what I say clear KPIs where you would say, okay, under these KPIs, I would like to see the country to become number 10 or whatever amongst the top number 10 in the world. So I believe there are some jobs to do, even though I think that the plan and the different building blocks of that plan is very good, is very right. Particularly this part, internationalization, is truly important because we have seen that in times of crisis, the international lead events perform much, much better than any kind of domestic events. Now let's look at the first decade in the millennium, first 10 years in this millennium, what has happened. Our industry, that is something very good, is showing design, innovation, and trends. How can you see that? If you look at all these buildings, starting from the left-hand side, that's Cologne. On the top, you have Hong Kong. On the right-hand side, you have Qatar. To the very left, you have Valencia, then Singapore, Abu Dhabi, and the three down here, you know, we are down here. So our industry is really showing design, innovation, trends, and I love that. And these are buildings really which we need, and to show also our industry is a trend-setter industry. That's very important. So what has happened in terms of turnover? Again, we have looked at the top 42 companies in the world, and you've seen that our industry has grown continuously, but you have a decline from 2008 to 2009. The top 10 companies have grown by 2.2%, whereas the rest have grown by 1.2%. So that's fairly impressive if you look at that 10 years. I believe that once the crisis is over, the business will pick up nicely again. In terms of capacity, again, we can see what has been shown before, GDP development. In the year 2000, the United States, if this is number one, the 100% line had 100% of capacity, and they increased the capacity by 53% in the last 10 years. Then you look into Europe, the capacity was increased by about the same amount as, by the same percentage as the United States. Asia, however, as a total, has increased, has doubled their capacity. And then you see China, who have increased their capacity by 150%. Of course, that's a tremendous amount. So Korea fits in here quite nicely, increased the capacity by 150%. And I think this is now the rate which is to be considered in the year 2012. So the development is somewhat in line with the overall Asian development. Now let's look at the price levels globally.